November 14th, 1988, 3:47 a.m. Barents Sea, 340 meters below the Arctic ice. The sound started as a whisper, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Senior sonar operator Dmitry Volkov pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, his knuckles turning white. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Around him, in the cramped sonar compartment of the Soviet nuclear attack submarine K-284 Akula, 3 other men sat frozen at their stations, their faces pale in the green glow of the instruments. The pulse came again, 18 hertz, a frequency so low it was barely audible, yet it vibrated through their skulls like a tuning fork pressed against bone. Volkov's hands began to shake, not from cold. The submarine maintained a steady 20 degrees Celsius. This was something else, something primal. A terror that seemed to rise from the base of his spine and spread through his entire body like ice water. "Turn it off," he whispered. "Comrade Captain, please, turn it off." But Captain First Rank Yuri Antonovich Berezin stood motionless behind him, his eyes fixed on the sonar display, watching the impossible pattern ripple across the screen. He had given the order to activate the system. He had known the risks. And now, as the pulse echoed through the hull of his submarine, he understood that some sounds, once heard, could never be unheard. What happened aboard K-284 that night would remain classified for over 3 decades. The incident would be erased from official naval records. The crew scattered to remote postings across the Soviet Union, sworn to silence under penalty of treason. But the sound followed them, into their dreams, into their waking hours, into the quiet moments when they thought they were finally safe. This is the story of the Akula Protocol, the most dangerous acoustic experiment in Cold War history, and the men who paid the price for hearing what was never meant to be heard. If you find this story compelling, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering these forgotten chapters of history. To understand what happened that night in the Barents Sea, we need to go back. Back to a time when the Cold War was fought not with missiles and bombs, but with silence, with shadows, with sounds that traveled through the black depths of the ocean, carrying secrets that could determine the fate of nations. September 3rd, 1985, Severodvinsk shipyard, Soviet Union. The submarine that would become K-284 slid into the White Sea on a gray autumn morning, her black hull cutting through the water like a knife. She was the 4th vessel of Project 971, the class that NATO would come to know as the Akula, Russian for shark. But the Soviets had a different name for her. They called her Shtuka B, the pike. A predator that lurked in the depths, silent and patient, waiting for its prey. Captain Yuri Berezin stood on the dock that morning, watching his future command take shape in the water. He was 43 years old, a veteran of 12 submarine patrols, and he had risen through the ranks of the Soviet Navy through a combination of skill, discipline, and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. His crew called him the Iceman behind his back. They meant it as a compliment. What they didn't know, or what no one knew, was that beneath that frozen exterior, Berezin carried a secret. He heard things that other men couldn't hear, sounds that shouldn't exist. It had started when he was a boy, growing up in Murmansk, where the winter winds howled through the streets like wounded animals. He would lie awake at night, listening to frequencies that seemed to come from the earth itself, low, rhythmic pulses that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. His mother had taken him to doctors, to specialists, even to a priest. They all said the same thing. There was nothing wrong with him. The sounds were in his head, but Berezin knew better. He knew the sounds were real, and he knew that someday, somehow, he would find their source. The Akula-class submarines represented the pinnacle of Soviet engineering, 110 meters long, displacing over 12,000 tons submerged, covered in anechoic tiles that made them nearly invisible to Western detection systems. But there was another system aboard K-284, one that didn't appear in any official documentation, one installed during final construction by technicians who wore no insignia. It was designated simply as Impulse 18, and its purpose was classified at the highest levels of Soviet military intelligence. March 7th, 1986, Northern Fleet Headquarters, Severomorsk. Captain Berezin sat in a windowless conference room facing 3 men in civilian suits. They had introduced themselves only by first names, Andrei, Viktor, and Sergei, but their bearing and their questions made clear they were not civilians, KGB, or perhaps something even more secretive. "You have been selected for a special assignment, Comrade Captain," Andrei said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but his eyes were cold. "Your submarine will be equipped with a new acoustic system. You will test this system under operational conditions and report your findings directly to us." Berezin kept his face expressionless. "What kind of system?" Victor slid a folder across the table. "Impulse 18 generates a focused acoustic pulse at 18 hertz. This frequency is below the threshold of normal human hearing, but it has unique properties. What kind of properties? The three men exchanged glances. Finally, Sergei spoke. During the Great Patriotic War, German scientists discovered that certain infrasonic frequencies could affect human physiology and psychology. Disorientation, nausea, panic, fear without apparent cause. The Americans have been researching similar technology since the 1960s. We believe they have already deployed prototype systems aboard their Los Angeles-class submarines. Berezin absorbed this information in silence. Acoustic weapons. Sound as a tool of warfare. It explained so much. The strange reports from submarine encounters over the past decade, the unexplained incidents that had been dismissed as equipment failures or crew fatigue. An Impulse 18, he asked. Andre leaned forward. Impulse 18 is the most powerful infrasonic generator ever created. In laboratory tests, it has induced severe psychological effects at ranges of up to 500 meters. Subjects reported overwhelming fear, auditory hallucinations, and temporary paralysis. Several experienced lasting psychological trauma. You want me to use this against American submarines? We want you to test its effectiveness in operational conditions. Berezin thought of the sounds he had heard all his life. Could this technology explain what he had experienced? I'll do it, he said. What Berezin didn't know, what the men in suits didn't tell him, was that Impulse 18 had a flaw. At close range, the system's acoustic energy didn't disperse outward as intended. It reflected off the ocean floor, off ice formations, off the submarine's own hull. In certain conditions, the pulse could amplify, creating standing waves of infrasonic energy that turned the submarine itself into a resonating chamber. The scientists who had designed the system knew this. 3 of them had already died during laboratory testing, 2 from cerebral hemorrhages, 1 by his own hand. But the project was too important to cancel. The Cold War demanded sacrifice, and the men aboard K-284 would never know they had been chosen to make that sacrifice. October 22nd, 1988, K-284, Norwegian Sea. The submarine had been at sea for 47 days when Berezin received the encrypted orders. They came through the VLF antenna, the very low-frequency system that allowed communication with submerged submarines. The message was brief. Proceed to designated coordinates. Conduct Impulse 18 test, report results. The coordinates placed them in deep water, far from shipping lanes, far from the prying ears of NATO's SOSUS network, the sound surveillance system that stretched across the Atlantic listening for Soviet submarines. It was the perfect location for a secret test. It was also, Berezin would later realize, the perfect location for something to go terribly wrong. Senior sonar operator Dmitry Volkov was 26 years old, the son of a fisherman from Vladivostok. He had been assigned to K-284 straight from the Naval Academy, where he had graduated first in his class in acoustic systems. His hearing was exceptional. He could detect frequency variations that other operators missed entirely. This gift had made him invaluable. It would also make him the first to suffer when Impulse 18 was activated. Comrade Captain, Volkov reported, we have reached the designated coordinates. Depth is 340 meters. No contacts on passive sonar. Conditions are optimal for the test. Berezin stood in the central command post, surrounded by the glow of instruments and the quiet hum of machinery. Around him, his crew of 73 men went about their duties, unaware of what was about to happen. Only he, the executive officer, and the 2 Impulse 18 technicians knew the true purpose of this patrol. Very well, Berezin said. All hands, rig for silent running. Sonar, prepare to activate the special equipment. The submarine fell into a deeper silence as non-essential systems were shut down. The constant background noise of fans and pumps faded to a whisper. In the sonar compartment, Volkov and his 3 operators watched as the technicians powered up the Impulse 18 system. The device itself was unremarkable. A rectangular metal housing behind the main sonar array, connected to its own dedicated power supply. When the technicians activated it, the submarine shuddered. Not from motion, K-284 hung motionless, but from something else, a vibration felt rather than heard. System active, one of the technicians reported. Pulse generation in 30 seconds. Berezin watched the countdown on the display. 20 seconds, 15, 10. He thought of all the sounds he had heard in his life, all the frequencies that had haunted him since childhood. Was this the answer he had been seeking? Or was it something else entirely? 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, 1. The pulse was invisible, inaudible, at least in any conventional sense, but every man aboard K-284 felt it. A wave of pressure that seemed to pass through their bodies, through the steel walls, through the water itself. It was like being struck by a silent explosion, a detonation that existed only in the realm of sound. In the sonar compartment, Dmitry Volkov screamed. The sound that tore from his throat was inhuman, a raw, primal shriek of terror that echoed through the submarine's compartments. He ripped the headphones from his ears and fell from his chair, his body convulsing on the deck. Around him, the other operators clutched their heads, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. "Shut it down!" Berezin shouted. "Shut it down now!" But the technicians were frozen, staring at their instruments in disbelief. The readings were impossible. The pulse hadn't dissipated as expected. It was reflecting, amplifying, building on itself like waves in a bathtub. The submarine's hull was resonating at 18 hertz, turning the entire vessel into a giant speaker broadcasting infrasound directly into the bodies of everyone aboard. Chief Engineer Alexei Petrov was in the reactor compartment when the pulse hit. He felt a sudden weight on his chest. His vision blurred, his thoughts scattered. And then, impossibly, he heard it. A voice that seemed to come from inside his own skull calling his name. He began to run, not toward emergency stations, but simply away, away from the voice, away from the sound. In the torpedo room, Warrant Officer Pavel Korolyov collapsed to the deck, curled into a fetal position, weeping uncontrollably. The other men, hardened sailors who had faced combat exercises against American carrier groups, were in similar states, some crying, some screaming, one beating his head against the torpedo rack with enough force to draw blood. Throughout the submarine, chaos reigned. The discipline that held a nuclear submarine together dissolved in seconds. And still the pulse continued. The resonance built on itself, the sound that wasn't a sound growing stronger, deeper, more invasive. It was inside them now, not just in their ears, but in their bones, their blood, their brains. In the command post, Captain Berezin stood alone among his collapsed crew. He felt the pulse, felt the fear trying to overwhelm him, but something in his mind pushed back. The sounds he had heard all his life, the frequencies that had haunted his childhood, had prepared him for this moment. His brain had adapted to infrasound in ways that others had not. But even he was not immune. His hands shook as he reached for the intercom. His voice cracked as he shouted orders that no one could hear. And in the back of his mind, behind the walls of discipline and training, something was beginning to crack. "Emergency surface," he commanded. "All compartments, emergency surface, blow all ballast tanks." The executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Viktor Morozov, crawled to the ballast controls. Blood ran from his nose, a common symptom of infrasound exposure, caused by ruptured capillaries in the sinuses. His eyes were wild, unfocused, but his training held. His hands found the levers. He pulled. Compressed air roared into the ballast tanks, forcing out the water that held them down. K-284 began to rise, her bow tilting upward as she clawed toward the surface. The depth gauge spun backward. 300 meters, 250, 200. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pulse stopped. The silence that followed was almost as shocking as the sound had been. Men lay where they had fallen, their breathing ragged, their bodies trembling. The submarine continued its ascent, breaching the surface in an explosion of spray and ice, her black hull rising into the gray Arctic daylight like a whale coming up for air. In the sonar compartment, Dmitry Volkov lay motionless on the deck. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but there was no one behind them. His body was breathing, his heart was beating, but his mind had retreated to somewhere deep inside, somewhere the sound couldn't reach. He would not speak for 11 days. November 2nd, 1988, Naval Hospital, Severomorsk. The ward was quiet, and the lights dimmed to ease the patient's constant headaches. 14 men from K-284 lay in beds arranged along both walls, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. These were the worst cases, the ones who had not recovered during the submarine's emergency return to port, the ones whose minds had been changed by what they had heard. Captain Berezin walked between the beds, his footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. He had already been debriefed by the men in civilian suits. They had been satisfied with the test results, they said. Impulse 18 had proven effective beyond their expectations. The psychological effects on the crew were regrettable but acceptable. The project would continue. Berezin had said nothing. He had signed the confidentiality agreements. He had accepted his promotion to Rear Admiral, the reward for his service, and then he had come here to face the men whose lives had been destroyed by his orders. Dmitry Volkov was in the last bed, by the window. He was sitting up now, the first time in days, but he did not turn when Berezin approached. He was staring at something beyond the glass, something only he could see. "Volkov," Berezin said softly. "Dmitry." The young man's head turned slowly as if it cost him great effort. His eyes found Berezin's face, and for a moment there was recognition. Then his expression collapsed into something like grief. "I can still hear it, Comrade Captain," he whispered. "When I close my eyes, when I try to sleep, it's always there. The pulse. It never stopped. Not really." Berezin's throat tightened. "The doctors say the symptoms will fade in time." "No." Volkov's voice was suddenly sharp. intense. You don't understand. I can hear it now. Right now. It's quieter than before, but it's there. Like a heartbeat. Like something breathing in the walls. He leaned forward, his eyes wide. I think it's still inside me, Comrade Captain. I think it put something inside me. Something that will never come out. Berezin had no response. What could he say? That the sound was an illusion, a product of trauma? That the terror would fade? That the memories would dim? He had heard the pulse himself. He knew it was more than just sound. It was something else. Something that operated on a level that science couldn't fully explain. In the weeks that followed, 7 of the 14 hospitalized men would be discharged to light duty. 3 would be medically retired. 2 transferred to psychiatric facilities, their conditions classified as paranoid schizophrenia to maintain secrecy. And 2 would die. November 14th, 1988, exactly 1 month after the incident. Lieutenant Sergei Mikhailov, the assistant sonar operator, was found in his hospital room at 3:47 a.m., the exact time the pulse had been activated aboard K-284. He had torn the IV from his arm and used the needle to open the veins in both wrists. The medical staff estimated he had been dead for less than an hour when they discovered him. The note he left behind was only 3 words. The sound stopped. Warrant Officer Pavel Korolyov, who had been found beating his head against the torpedo rack during the incident, died 2 days later. His cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but the autopsy revealed something strange. His heart muscle showed signs of extreme stress, as if he had been running a marathon at the moment of death. His roommate reported that Korolyov had woken at 3:47 a.m., screaming about the pulse, before his heart simply gave out. The correlation was too clear to ignore. Both deaths occurred at exactly the time the Impulse 18 system had been activated, 1 month earlier, but the men in civilian suits dismissed it as coincidence. Post-traumatic stress, psychological fragility. The project was too important to be derailed by 2 casualties. Dmitry Volkov was released from the hospital on November 20th. He was given a medical discharge from the Navy, a modest pension, and strict orders never to discuss what had happened aboard K-284. He returned to Vladivostok, to his father's fishing boat, to a life as far from submarines as he could manage. But the sound followed him. Every night at 3:47 a.m., Volkov woke in his narrow bunk, his body drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He could hear it, the pulse, the heartbeat, the breathing in the walls. Sometimes it was quiet, almost gentle, like a mother's whisper. Other times it was deafening, a roar that filled his skull until he thought it would crack. He tried alcohol. He tried sleeping pills. He tried staying awake until dawn, working the fishing nets until his body collapsed from exhaustion. Nothing helped. The sound was inside him now, a permanent resident in the deepest chambers of his brain. It had changed something fundamental about the way he perceived the world. And the strangest part was this. Sometimes, when the pulse was at its loudest, Volkov could almost understand it, almost make out words in the pattern, meaning in the rhythm. It was trying to tell him something, he was sure of it, something important, something that had been buried in the deep ocean for a very long time, waiting for someone to find it. But what Volkov didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he was not alone. December 1988, Moscow. In a secure facility beneath the Ministry of Defense, a team of scientists studied the data from the K-284 incident. The results were remarkable. Impulse 18 had exceeded all expectations. The psychological effects on the test subjects were severe and lasting. With refinement, the system could be deployed against enemy submarines, incapacitating their crews without firing a single weapon. But there were anomalies in the data, patterns that didn't fit the models. During the incident, the Impulse 18 system had generated a pulse at the expected frequency of 18 Hz, but the submarine sensors had also detected a secondary signal, a response pulse originating from somewhere outside the hull. The return signal matched the frequency exactly, 18 Hz. But its waveform was different, more complex, almost organic in its structure. It was as if something in the deep ocean had heard the pulse and answered. The scientists spent months analyzing the signal. They consulted with acoustic engineers, biologists, oceanographers. No one could explain it. There was no known natural phenomenon that could produce such a precise response at such a specific frequency. The signal appeared to have originated from a depth of over 4,000 meters, far below the dive limit of any submarine, in the lightless depths where the pressure would crush steel like paper. Some of the scientists began to develop their own theories that they dared not share with their superiors, theories about what might live in those depths, what might have been listening all along, waiting for humanity to develop the technology to communicate with it. But the Cold War had no time for speculation. The project continued. New Akula submarines were equipped with improved Impulse 18 systems, their crews selected for psychological resilience. The K-284 incidents were buried in classified files, the victims sworn to silence. the dead honored only with anonymous entries in naval records. And deep beneath the Arctic ice, in the cold darkness where no light had ever penetrated, something continued to pulse at 18 hertz, patient, waiting, listening. February 23rd, 1989, K322, Cachalot, North Atlantic. The second incident occurred without warning. K322 was shadowing an American carrier group south of Iceland. The submarine had the improved Impulse 18 Mark II, which was supposed to be safer. The scientists had assured that the resonance problems were corrected. They were wrong. Captain Second Rank Nikolai Orlov was a cautious officer who had read the classified K284 reports. He had no intention of activating Impulse 18 unless directly ordered. But the Americans were closing in. Their P-3 Orion aircraft had been circling for hours, dropping sonobuoys. K322 had gone deep and quiet, but it wasn't enough. The encrypted order came through the VLF antenna at 0200 hours. Activate Impulse 18. Create diversion. Escape to deep water. Orlov stared at the message for a long moment. He thought of the men aboard K284, the ones who had died, the ones who still heard the pulse in their sleep. He thought of his own crew, 68 men who trusted him to bring them home safely. Then he gave the order. Activate special equipment, single pulse, minimum power, target bearing 270. The sonar operators carried out the command with trembling hands. They had all heard the rumors about K284. They knew what the system could do. But orders were orders, and in the Soviet Navy, disobedience meant more than dismissal. It meant disgrace, prison, perhaps death. The pulse went out. A single burst of infrasonic energy directed toward the American search pattern. At minimum power, the effects should have been negligible. A moment of disorientation for the American sonobuoy operators, nothing more. But something went wrong. The pulse hit the thermocline, the boundary between warm surface water and cold deep water, and refracted downward, focusing and amplifying as it descended into the depths. The acoustic energy that reached the ocean floor was 10 times more powerful than what had been emitted from the submarine. And then came the response. Senior sonar operator Alexei Kuznetsov was the first to detect it. "Comrade Captain," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear, "I'm picking up a return signal, bearing 350, depth estimated at 4,200 meters." Orlov felt his blood run cold. 4,000 meters. Nothing could survive at that depth. Nothing could generate a signal from that depth. And yet the sonar display showed it clearly. A pulse at exactly 18 hertz, rising from the abyss like a voice from the grave. "That's impossible," the executive officer whispered. "There's nothing down there. Our charts show nothing but abyssal plain." "The signal is strengthening," Kuznetsov reported. His voice was cracking now, losing its professional steadiness. It's getting closer, rising, bearing unchanged, depth now 3,800 meters. Whatever it was coming up, coming toward them. "Ahead, full," Orlov commanded. "Course 270. Get us out of here." The submarine surged forward, her reactor pushing her through the water at maximum speed. The crew worked in focused silence, their training overriding the fear that gripped them. They had all heard the signal now, through the hull, through the walls, a pulsing rhythmic sound that seemed to resonate with their own heartbeats. But K322 was fast, one of the fastest submarines in the world. Whatever was rising from the depths couldn't possibly keep up with them. They would escape. They would report the incident. They would let the scientists figure out what had answered their call. "Depth of the signal?" Orlov demanded. 3,000 meters? Still rising? Still on same bearing. Kuznetsov paused, his face going white. "Comrade Captain, it's matching our course. It's following us." For 37 minutes, K322 ran at maximum speed while the signal pursued. It rose through the water with impossible velocity, tracking their every course change. At 2,000 meters, headaches and nausea began. At 1,000, men heard whispers in the pulse. At 500 meters, exactly the effective range of Impulse 18, the signal stopped. The silence lasted for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then, the entire submarine shuddered as something massive passed beneath them, so close that the turbulence nearly sent them into an uncontrolled dive. The sonar recorded a blur of noise, biological sounds, the scientists would later determine, but from no species in any database, something large. Something that had risen from depths where nothing should survive. And then it was gone, descending back into the abyss as quickly as it had risen until the sonar lost it in the background noise of the deep ocean. K322 returned to port 3 days later. Unlike K284, the crew had not experienced a full psychological breakdown. The exposure had been brief, the symptoms mild. But something had changed in every man aboard, something in the way they looked at the ocean, the way they flinched at certain sounds, the way they woke at exactly 2 a.m. Every night, their hearts pounding, their minds filled with images of something vast and patient rising from the darkness below. Captain Orloff included a detailed report of the incident in his patrol log. 3 days later, he was informed that the relevant sections had been removed and classified. He was transferred to a desk job in Moscow and never served at sea again. The official explanation for K-322's early return was equipment malfunction. The scientists filed the sonar recordings under a designation that didn't appear in any index. And somewhere in the bowels of the Soviet military apparatus, a decision was made. The Impulse 18 project would continue, but all tests would be conducted in shallow water, far from the deep ocean trenches where something seemed to be listening. But the incidents didn't stop. July 1989, K-263 Delphine, Sea of Okhotsk. August 1989, K-391 Bratsk, Laptov Sea. October 1989, K-317 Pantera, Norwegian Sea. Each time the same pattern, Impulse 18 activation followed by a response from the deep. Each time the signal came from impossible depths, rising with impossible speed. Each time the crew experienced lasting symptoms. The scientists developed theories, new deep-sea creatures, geological phenomena, or explanations they dared not voice publicly. But all agreed, whatever was down there, it was getting closer with each incident. December 3rd, 1989, K-284, 1 year after the original incident. The submarine had been repaired, refitted, and returned to service with a new captain. Captain First Rank Vladimir Sorokin was younger, more ambitious. He believed that with proper training, his men could operate Impulse 18 without ill effects. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The patrol had been routine until they reached the same coordinates where the original incident occurred. What Sorokin didn't know was that something had changed. The response signal had been returning regularly, pulsing at 18 hertz, as if waiting. Deepwater sensors had recorded it multiple times, but that information hadn't been shared with him. Special equipment standing by, the sonar operator reported. His name was Grigory Volkov, Dmitri's younger brother, who had joined the submarine service despite his family's protests, determined to discover what had happened to his brother, what had stolen his mind and left only a broken shell behind. "Activate on my command," Sorokin said. He felt a tremor of unease, quickly suppressed. This was just superstition, he told himself. Just the legacy of an incident that had been caused by equipment malfunction and crew weakness. His men were better trained, his equipment was improved, nothing would go wrong. Activate. The pulse went out. 18 hertz, maximum power directed into the depths below. The sonar operators tracked its progress, watching it descend through the water column, bounce off the ocean floor, dissipate into the endless blackness. For 17 seconds, nothing happened. Then the response came. It was different this time, stronger, closer. The signal didn't originate from the abyssal depths. It came from less than 800 meters below them, as if something had been waiting just beneath the submarine, anticipating the pulse, ready to answer. The effect on the crew was immediate and catastrophic. Grigory Volkov screamed his brother's name as the sound hit him, the same 18 hertz that had destroyed Dmitri's mind, now tearing through his own consciousness. Around him, men collapsed at their stations, their bodies seizing, their minds flooding with images that couldn't possibly be real, visions of vast darkness, of something ancient and patient stirring in the deep, of lights that weren't lights and sounds that weren't sounds, and a hunger that had waited for millions of years for something to wake it. Captain Sorokin tried to give orders, but the words wouldn't come. His throat had closed, his lungs had frozen, his entire body had become a receiver for the signal that was now emanating from somewhere below, no, from everywhere, from the water itself, from the hull, from the air he breathed. He could feel it inside him, probing, searching, trying to find something it had lost, or perhaps something it had been looking for all along. The submarine began to sink. Without anyone at the controls, without any commands being given, K-284 tilted forward and dove toward the source of the signal. The depth gauge spun, 400 meters, 500, 600, past the test depth, past the design depth, into the crushing pressure where the hull would eventually give way. And through it all, the sound continued. The 18 hertz pulse that had started as a weapon had become something else, a communication, a summons, a call that the submarine's crew were helpless to resist. At 712 meters, the emergency systems activated. Automatic buoyancy reserves deployed, forcing air into the ballast tanks, fighting against the submarine's descent. The hull groaned under the pressure, but it held. The dive slowed, stopped, reversed. K-284 rose from the depths a second time, breaching the surface in the same gray Arctic waters where she had surfaced a year before. But this time, there was no one conscious to witness it. Every member of the crew had collapsed, their minds overwhelmed by what they had experienced. They would remain unconscious for over 18 hours. And when they finally woke, none of them could remember exactly what had happened after the pulse was activated. They remembered fear, they remembered the sound, and they remembered something else, something that their conscious minds refused to acknowledge, but that their subconscious would replay endlessly in the months and years to come. They remembered seeing something rising from below, vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond imagination, looking at them with something that might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. And they remembered the sound it made when it recognized them. March 9, Vladivostok. Dmitry Volkov sat on the deck of his father's fishing boat, watching the sun set over the harbor. He had been home for over a year now, his naval career a distant memory, his days filled with the simple rhythms of fishing and maintenance and the endless expanse of the sea. But the sea was different now. He couldn't look at it without thinking of what lay beneath, the darkness, the pressure, the things that lived in the depths where no light penetrated. Every time the boat passed over deep water, he felt the pulse stirring inside him, responding to something far below. He had received a letter 3 days ago. His brother Grigory was in a naval hospital in Severomorsk, the same ward where Dmitry had spent those terrible weeks after the first incident. The doctor said he was recovering. The doctors were lying. Dmitry had called the hospital, begging to speak with his brother. They had finally connected him, after hours of waiting, to a ward where Grigory lay staring at the ceiling with eyes that saw nothing in this world. "Mitya," Grigory had whispered when he heard his brother's voice. "Is that you? Can you hear it too?" "Hear what, Grisha?" "The pulse, the heartbeat. It's different now, faster, like something waking up." A pause, then a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "It knows my name now, Mitya. It knows all our names. It's been waiting so long, and now we've finally told it we're here." The connection had gone dead. Dmitry had called back, but they told him Grigory could no longer receive calls. 2 weeks later, he received official notification. Grigory Volkov had died of cardiac arrest on March 15, 1990, at exactly 3:47 a.m. Moscow time. The same time the pulse had first been activated. The same time Dmitry woke every night, his heart pounding, his mind filled with the sound of something breathing in the walls. Dmitry stood up from the deck and walked to the bow of the fishing boat. Below him, the water was black in the fading light, featureless, infinite. He knew now that he would never be free of what had happened aboard K-284. The sound had changed him in ways that couldn't be undone. It had made him part of something larger, something that stretched from the cold depths of the Barents Sea to wherever the signal originated. But he also knew something else, something that had come to him slowly over the past months, building like the distant thunder of an approaching storm. The sound was not malevolent, not exactly. It was vast and alien and utterly indifferent to human concerns, but it was not actively hostile. It simply was what it was, an intelligence, or an echo of intelligence, that existed in a realm where human concepts of good and evil had no meaning. And it was growing louder. April 15th, 1991, Soviet Ministry of Defense, Moscow. The committee convened in a secure conference room, surrounded by the highest levels of Soviet military and scientific leadership. The topic, the future of the Impulse 18 project, and its implications for national security. The reports were damning. Since 1988, 14 submarines had experienced incidents related to the Impulse 18 system. 47 men had died, some during the incidents themselves, others in the weeks and months that followed. Over 200 more had been medically discharged with permanent psychological damage. The financial cost was astronomical. The human cost was incalculable. But the response signals were the real concern. We have confirmed 17 separate instances of return signals originating from depths greater than 3,000 meters, the lead scientist reported. Each signal matches the frequency of the Impulse 18 pulse exactly. Each signal exhibits characteristics that are inconsistent with any known natural phenomenon. And each signal demonstrates apparent intelligence, responding to our transmissions, tracking our submarines, exhibiting what can only be described as curiosity. "Are you suggesting," one of the admirals asked slowly, "that we have made contact with something?" "I am suggesting that we have attracted the attention of something that was perhaps dormant, or perhaps simply waiting. And I am suggesting that with each activation of the Impulse 18 system, we have been providing it with information, teaching it, showing it where we are and what we are capable of." The room fell silent. The implications were too vast to comprehend fully. For decades, the Soviet Union and the United States had been playing a game of chess beneath the ocean's surface, their submarines stalking each other through the darkness, listening for any sound that might betray an enemy's position. But now it seemed that someone else had been listening too. Someone who had been waiting far longer than humanity had existed. Someone who was finally starting to wake up. The decision was made that day to terminate the Impulse 18 project. All equipment was to be removed, all records classified at the highest level, all personnel reassigned and sworn to secrecy. And one final order: under no circumstances was any Soviet submarine to transmit at 18 hertz ever again. It was a reasonable precaution. There was just one problem. The Americans had already begun their own research. June 1991, United States Navy, Naval Research Laboratory. The classified program was called Deep Echo. Its purpose, to develop a low-frequency acoustic system for detecting enemy submarines at extreme ranges. The technology was similar to Impulse 18. The American scientists didn't know about the Soviet incidents. They didn't know something was already listening. Their first test was scheduled for September 1991. August 1991, Moscow. The Soviet Union was dying. In the chaos that followed the failed coup, many classified programs were abandoned, their secrets scattered. But some secrets were too dangerous to die with the empire that created them. In late August, a former KGB officer named Andrei visited Dmitry Volkov in Vladivostok. He carried everything the Soviet government knew about Impulse 18, technical specifications, incident reports, the analysis of the response signals. "The Americans are about to make a terrible mistake," Andrei said. "They don't know what we know." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only one left who might understand, who might stop them." Andrei left the folder on the table. The world is changing. Old enemies becoming friends. But some enemies are older than nations. He walked to the door, then paused. "The pulse is getting stronger, isn't it? You feel it too. We all do. Everyone who heard it, everyone who was touched by it. It's building to something. Something that's been preparing for a very long time." "What does it want?" Volkov asked. "What is it waiting for?" Andrei's face was hidden in shadow, but his voice carried a weight of exhaustion and fear. "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe it simply wants to know that we exist, to confirm that after billions of years of waiting, there's finally something in the universe worth paying attention to." He left without another word. Volkov sat alone in his apartment, the folder unopened on the table before him, the pulse echoing through his skull like a countdown to something he couldn't name. Outside, the night was clear and cold. The stars burned in the darkness with a light that had traveled millions of years to reach his eyes. Somewhere beneath the waves, in the crushing depths where no human could survive, something was stirring. Something that had heard humanity's first faltering attempts at communication and had decided at last to respond. The Cold War was ending, but a far older war was just beginning. A war that would determine whether humanity was ready to take its place among the voices of the deep, or whether it would become just another silence in the endless darkness of the universe. September 15th, 1991, USS Memphis North Atlantic. The American submarine received the signal at 0347 hours, an 18 hertz pulse originating from somewhere far below, from a depth that their instruments could barely register. The crew didn't know what it meant. They didn't know that Soviet submarines had been receiving the same signal for years. They didn't know that something in the darkness had learned their frequency and was calling out to them. All they knew was that for the first time in their lives, they could hear something that had no name, no source, no explanation. A sound that reached into their minds and planted a single terrifying thought. It knows we're here. And 12,000 miles away, in a small apartment in Vladivostok, Dmitry Volkov woke from a dreamless sleep at exactly 3:47 a.m. The pulse was singing in his blood, stronger than ever before, and for the first time, he could make out words in the pattern, a message that had been waiting for years to be understood. "We hear you," the voice from the deep said. "We have always heard you, and now, at last, we are ready to answer." The story of the Akula protocol didn't end that night. It continued in classified reports and secret conferences, in the nightmares of submarine veterans, and the research of oceanographers who found things in the depths that defied explanation. It continued in the international treaties that quietly banned certain acoustic frequencies, in the unexplained behavior of deep-sea creatures, in the anomalous signals that still pulse through the world's oceans at exactly 18 hertz. And it continued in the men who survived, the ones who still wake at 3:47 a.m., their hearts pounding and their minds filled with the sound of something vast and patient waiting in the darkness below. They never talk about what happened. They never share their experiences with doctors or therapists or family members who might try to understand. They simply live with it, carrying the weight of a secret that the world is not yet ready to hear. Because some sounds once heard can never be unheard, and some knowledge once gained changes everything. In 2003, a decommissioned Akula-class submarine was being prepared for scrapping at a shipyard in Severodvinsk. Workers removing equipment from the sonar compartment discovered a metal plate bolted to the hull behind the main array, the mounting point for an Impulse 18 system that had been removed years before. Beneath the plate, someone had scratched a message into the steel with a knife or screwdriver. It was in Russian, and it read, "We called into the darkness. The darkness answered, 'God forgive us for what we have awakened.'" The workers reported the discovery to their supervisors. The report was filed and forgotten. The submarine was cut apart and melted down, its steel recycled into cars and appliances and 1,000 other products that now circulate through the world, carrying traces of the vessel that first called into the deep and received an answer. And somewhere beneath the ocean, in the crushing darkness where no light has ever penetrated, something continues to pulse at 18 hertz, waiting, listening, remembering the coordinates of every submarine that ever transmitted the forbidden frequency. Remembering and preparing for the day when it will finally rise to meet its callers face to face. June 29, Vladivostok. Dmitry Volkov was 76 years old when he gave his last interview. His health was failing. Decades of hearing the pulse had taken their toll. But he agreed to speak with a documentary filmmaker who had learned about the K-284 incident. "You want to know what I heard," Volkov said. "That first moment when the pulse came back from the deep, as if I could put it into words." He paused, staring at the harbor where he had spent years trying to forget. "It sounded like a heartbeat," he said finally. "Not a human heartbeat. Something older, something slower. A rhythm that had been going on since the earth was young, since the oceans first filled the basins and the darkness first learned to think." He turned to face the camera, his eyes still sharp despite his age. "People ask me if I'm afraid. They expect me to say yes. But fear is not the right word. Fear is what you feel when you don't understand something. And I understand perfectly well what I heard that night in 1988. "What was it?" the filmmaker asked. Volkov smiled, a thin, tired expression that contained no joy. "It was an introduction, a greeting, the first word in a conversation that will last longer than human civilization. We thought we were hunting submarines. We thought we were fighting a Cold War against America. But we were really just children, playing with a telephone we had found, not realizing that someone had been listening on the other end since before we learned to speak." "And what happens now?" Volkov leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The pulse was quiet today, barely a whisper in the back of his mind, a familiar companion after all these years. "Now we wait," he said. "We wait to see if the conversation continues, if what we called up from the deep decides that we are worth talking to, or if it decides that we are just another noise in the ocean, another signal to be cataloged and filed away with all the other sounds that have echoed through the water since the world began." He opened his eyes one last time. "But I'll tell you this much. Whatever is down there, it has been listening for a very long time, longer than we can imagine. And now that it knows we're here, it has all the time in the world to decide what to do about us." Dmitry Volkov died in his sleep on September 14th, 2019, at exactly 3:47 a.m. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. His family buried him at sea, as he had requested, in the deep waters off the coast of Vladivostok. And some say that on quiet nights, when the wind is still and the ocean is calm, you can still hear the pulse echoing from the depths, a rhythm that has continued since before humans walked the earth, a heartbeat that will continue long after they are gone. The Soviet Akula submarine program officially ended with the dissolution of the USSR. The boats themselves were decommissioned one by one, their reactors removed, their hulls scrapped or converted into museums. The sailors who served aboard them scattered to the four corners of the former empire, carrying their memories and their secrets into quiet retirements. But the Impulse 18 technology did not disappear entirely. Fragments found their way into American laboratories, Chinese programs, black projects seeking any underwater advantage. And occasionally, a submarine reports hearing something strange, an 18 hertz pulse from far below. The reports are always classified, the crews always debriefed, and the submarines always returned safely, their officers refusing to discuss what they experienced. But among veterans of the world's submarine services, there is a saying passed down through generations, whispered in bars and bunks. Never call into the deep, because the deep always answers. And somewhere beneath the waves, in the vast darkness that covers more than 2/3 of our planet, something continues to listen. Something that heard our first fumbling attempts at communication and recognized, perhaps for the first time in billions of years, that it was no longer alone. Something that is still waiting to see what we will say next. This is the legacy of the Akula protocol. Not a weapon or tactical advantage, but something far more significant. The first evidence that humanity is not alone in the universe, and the realization that the universe has been aware of us far longer than we have been aware of it. The pulse continues, the heartbeat goes on, And somewhere in the depths, something continues its endless vigil, waiting for the day when we are finally ready to continue the conversation that began on a November night in 1988, when a Soviet submarine called into the darkness, and the darkness, at long last, called back. The end? No, this is only the beginning. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support helps us explore these hidden chapters of history. Until next time, some secrets are buried for a reason, but the truth, like a pulse at 18 hertz, has a way of rising to the surface when the time is right.